Let's get one thing straight. People often misunderstand an empath. They see kindness and they assume fragility. They see patience and they assume passivity. They see compassion and they assume tolerance without limit. That is a dangerous misread, because an empath is not weak. An empath is aware. They are paying attention when nobody else is. They notice the shift in your voice. They catch the contradiction in your story. They feel the tension behind your smile, the resentment behind your silence, the dishonesty behind your charm. And here is the brutal truth. The empath usually knows long before they say anything. They know when they are being used. They know when they are being lied to. They know when they are being emotionally drained. And still, many of them stay longer than they should, not because they are blind, but because they believe in healing, in grace, in second chances, and in the possibility that people can do better. That is what makes hurting an empath so costly. When you hurt a deeply empathetic person, you are not just damaging a moment. You are damaging a safe place. You are damaging trust that was given carefully. You are damaging the part of human connection that cannot be faked. And once that damage is complete, do not confuse their silence with ignorance. Do not confuse their withdrawal with defeat. Do not confuse their calm with absence of consequence. Sometimes the empath does not explode. Sometimes they simply see clearly. And when they see clearly, everything changes. The first brutal consequence of hurting an empath is this: you lose access to the version of them that loved you without armor. That version is rare. That version is generous. That version listens between your words. That version roots for your healing even while carrying their own pain. Once that disappears, you may still see the person, but you will never again experience them the same way. Why? Because pain educates the empath. It teaches them where they abandoned themselves. It teaches them where compassion became self-neglect. It teaches them that understanding someone's wounds does not require tolerating someone's abuse. That lesson is powerful. The second brutal consequence is this: the empath stops explaining. In the beginning, they explain, they communicate, they clarify, they try to fix what is broken, they give language to tension, they hand you the map. But when they realize you understood the whole time and still chose harm, something shuts off. Not out of cruelty, out of clarity. And once an empath reaches clarity, they become very difficult to manipulate. They stop chasing closure from people committed to confusion. They stop begging for honesty from people invested in control. They stop shrinking themselves to make dishonest people comfortable. Now pay attention, because this is where the lesson gets deeper. The third brutal consequence of hurting an empath is not what happens to them. It is what happens to you. You lose someone who could have seen the best in you, while also seeing the truth. You lose someone who could detect your pain without you fully naming it. You lose someone who would have stayed loyal through storms if only you had treated that loyalty with respect. And that loss does something to a person, because eventually you realize that not everyone offers depth. Not everyone offers sincerity. Not everyone offers emotional presence. You may find attention again. You may find attraction again. You may find convenience again. But genuine emotional safety? That is rare. And when you destroy it with carelessness, ego, deception, or repeated disrespect, the consequence is not always immediate. Sometimes it arrives later, when the room is quiet and the replacements feel empty. That is when it hits. You did not lose someone too sensitive. You lost someone who finally became sensitive to their own worth. That is the shift. An empath who has been hurt enough does not become heartless. They become selective. They become discerning. They become impossible to access through the old doors. And that transformation is often mistaken for coldness. It is not coldness. It is intelligence finally working together with compassion. That is a dangerous combination for anyone who relied on their silence, patience, or forgiveness as permission to continue harmful behavior. So what is the educational lesson here? Simple. Never weaponize someone's understanding. Never mistake emotional generosity for endless availability. Never assume that a person who gives grace lacks boundaries. And never think that because someone loves deeply, they will stay through everything. People with deep empathy often leave quietly, but they leave completely. And when they do not just remove their presence. They remove their energy, their belief in you, their emotional investment, their advocacy, their softness, their benefit of the doubt. That absence becomes the punishment. Now here is the motivational part. If you have hurt an empath, learn from it, not with guilt. With growth, become more honest, become more regulated, become more accountable. Say what you mean. Respect what is pure. Handle people's trust like it is expensive, because it is. And if you are the empath, hear this clearly. Your pain was not proof that you were weak. Your heartbreak was not proof that you were foolish. Your compassion was not a mistake. The mistake was believing that your depth had to be offered where it was not valued. Let that end today. You do not need to harden your heart. You need to sharpen your boundaries. You do not need to stop caring. You need to care with wisdom. You do not need to become less loving. You need to become less available to what dishonors your love. Because the most powerful empath is not the one who feels everything. It is the one who understands everything and still chooses self-respect. So remember this, hurting an empath has brutal consequences, not because they destroy you, but because they eventually stop rescuing you from the consequences of who you chose to be. And once that happens, all you are left with is yourself. When people hurt an empath, they usually think they are only winning a moment, gaining control, or getting away with careless behavior. But what they fail to understand is that an empath is not simply someone who feels deeply. It is someone who observes deeply, absorbs patterns quickly, and learns from emotional pain with unusual precision, which means the real consequence of hurting such a person is not dramatic revenge but irreversible withdrawal of trust, warmth, access, and emotional loyalty. An empath often gives more chances than most people deserve because they naturally try to understand motives, wounds, fears, and insecurities behind harmful behavior. And this is exactly why many people misjudge them, assuming patience means weakness, forgiveness means blindness, and compassion means unlimited tolerance, when in reality empathy is often paired with high awareness, strong intuition, and silent emotional data collection. So while the empath may remain calm on the surface, they are internally recording inconsistencies, broken promises, manipulative tone shifts, selfish patterns, and the repeated gap between what someone says and what they actually do. And once this inner evidence becomes undeniable, something critical changes. The empath stops trying to rescue the connection. That change is brutal, because before that moment, the empath was often the emotional stabilizer in the relationship, the one offering understanding during conflict, softness during stress, encouragement during insecurity, and hope during confusion. But after repeated hurt, they begin to realize that understanding another person does not require sacrificing themselves for that person. And that lesson is one of the most powerful emotional awakenings a human being can experience. The first consequence, then, is that the person who caused the damage loses the most genuine version of the empath, the version that listened without judgment, loved without calculation, and gave emotional safety without demanding perfection. And once that version disappears, it rarely returns in the same form, because pain teaches boundaries, and boundaries teach selectivity. The second consequence is that the empath becomes quiet in a new way, not confused, not broken, but clear. And that clarity is often mistaken for coldness by those who benefited from their openness. Yet it is actually self-respect becoming visible. Because a healed empath no longer wastes energy explaining the obvious to people committed to misunderstanding them, no longer chases apologies that come without change, and no longer begs for honesty from those who are comfortable living in emotional contradiction. The third consequence is educational and deeply important. Hurting an empath often reveals more about the offender than about the victim, because it exposes immaturity, poor emotional regulation, entitlement, or the habit of treating sincere people as if they are endlessly available. And sooner or later, the person who caused the harm discovers that attention is easy to replace. But genuine emotional presence is not. Loyalty is not. And being deeply understood by someone who truly wanted your growth is not. Which means the loss becomes heavier with time, especially when future relationships feel shallow by comparison. From a psychological standpoint, the empath does not become less human after betrayal. They become more discerning, which is healthy, because empathy without boundaries becomes self-abandonment, while empathy with wisdom becomes strength, and that is the central lesson here. If you are given the trust of a deeply empathetic person, treat it as something rare, because once repeated disrespect teaches them to close the door. What you lose is not just a relationship, but access to a level of emotional honesty many people search for their entire lives and never find. And if you are the empath, the message is just as powerful. Do not interpret your pain as proof that your caring nature was a mistake, because your depth is not the problem. Your value is not the problem. The problem was offering sacred emotional energy to people who only knew how to consume it. So let the pain educate you. Let the betrayal sharpen your standards, and let your future compassion be guided by discernment. Because the strongest empath is not the one who keeps enduring harm to prove love, but the one who learns that protecting their peace is also an act of love. People often misunderstand what an empath really is, because they confuse emotional sensitivity with emotional weakness, when in fact an empath is usually someone with a highly developed ability to read behavior, detect hidden tension, notice contradictions, and feel the emotional climate around them with unusual accuracy. That means when such a person is hurt, the damage goes far beyond a single argument, betrayal, or act of disrespect. An empath often gives more patience than most people deserve because they try to understand what pain, insecurity, fear, or unresolved wounds may be driving another person's actions. And this willingness to understand is exactly why they are so often taken for granted. Many people assume that if an empath keeps forgiving, keeps listening, and keeps showing up, then the empath must not fully see what is happening. In reality, the opposite is usually true. They see more than they say. They notice the shift in tone, the small dishonesty, the emotional manipulation, the selfish pattern, and the repeated failure between what someone promises and what someone actually does. The real consequence of hurting an empath, then, is not immediate revenge, but deep internal recalibration. At first, they may try to repair the relationship, explain their pain, offer another chance, or hold on to hope that honesty and maturity will still appear. But once they realize that their kindness is being used as permission for repeated harm, something important changes in them. They stop trying to rescue the bond at the expense of themselves. This is where the lesson becomes powerful. Empathy without boundaries becomes self-neglect, but empathy joined with self-respect becomes strength. The person who hurt them usually does not realize the seriousness of what has happened because the empath may not become loud, dramatic, or vindictive. Instead, they become clear. They become quieter, more selective, more emotionally disciplined, and less available to confusion. That quiet distance is not weakness, it is awareness deciding it will no longer volunteer for pain. The first brutal outcome is the permanent loss of access to the most open, loyal, warm, and trusting version of the empath. And that version is often far more valuable than people understand in the moment. The educational truth hidden inside this situation is that hurting an empath often exposes the character of the person causing the harm more than it harms the empath forever, because it reveals emotional immaturity, lack of discipline, entitlement, dishonesty, or the habit of treating genuine care as if it were unlimited and cheap. Over time, the empath learns the lesson and evolves, but the person who caused the damage may later discover what they truly lost. It is easy to replace attention, convenience, attraction, or surface-level interaction, but it is not easy to replace someone who offered sincere emotional safety, patient understanding, and real depth. An empath often serves as an emotional stabilizer in relationships, bringing calm during tension, insight during confusion, encouragement during insecurity, and compassion during difficult seasons. So when that person withdraws for good, the absence is often felt much later and much more heavily than expected. What makes it brutal is that the empath does not usually leave because they stopped caring. They leave because they finally started caring for themselves with equal seriousness. That difference matters. They do not become cruel. They become discerning. They do not stop loving. They stop giving love where it is repeatedly dishonored. For the empath, the lesson is equally important. Pain should not convince them that their caring nature was a mistake. Their depth is not the problem. Their willingness to see good in people is not the problem. The mistake was extending precious emotional energy to people who wanted comfort without accountability, closeness without honesty, and loyalty without responsibility. Real growth means understanding that compassion should be guided by wisdom, not by guilt, fear, or the need to prove one's goodness through endurance. The strongest empath is not the one who tolerates endless hurt to show love. It is the one who learns that healthy love includes limits, standards, and self-protection. So the deeper message is simple and transformative. If you are trusted by a person who feels deeply and sees clearly, handle that trust carefully, because once repeated disrespect teaches them to close the door, what disappears is not just their presence, but their belief in you, their emotional investment in you, and the rare kind of connection that many people search for all their lives and never truly find. An empath is often misunderstood because people confuse emotional depth with fragility, when in reality an empath is usually highly observant, psychologically alert, and skilled at detecting what others try to hide. Such a person does not only hear words, they notice pauses, contradictions, changes in tone, and the emotional tension underneath behavior. This is why hurting an empath creates consequences that are far more serious than most people imagine. The damage is not limited to a painful moment, a broken promise, or a careless act of disrespect. It changes the internal way that person relates to trust, attachment, and emotional safety. Many empaths give repeated chances, not because they are blind, but because they genuinely want to understand what pain, insecurity, fear, or immaturity is driving another person's harmful behavior. They often believe that with enough honesty, patience, and compassion, a relationship can improve. That is exactly why people who take advantage of them make such a serious mistake. They assume kindness means weakness, forgiveness means forgetfulness, and loyalty means permanence. But empathy is not the absence of awareness. It is awareness with feeling. An empath often sees the truth long before they speak about it, and while they may remain calm and composed, they are silently measuring patterns, noticing repeated dishonesty, and recognizing when their emotional generosity is being treated as something cheap and endlessly available. The first major consequence of hurting an empath is that you lose access to the most open and trusting version of them. Before repeated hurt, an empath often offers something rare: emotional presence without pretense, listening without immediate judgment, and concern that is rooted in sincerity rather than obligation. They may become the stabilizing force in a relationship, bringing calm to chaos, insight to confusion, and warmth to moments of emotional distance. Yet once they realize that their care is being exploited instead of respected, something changes at a very deep level. They stop trying to rescue the connection. They stop over-explaining the pain you already caused. They stop begging for honesty from someone who benefited from confusion. This withdrawal is not always dramatic, which is why many people fail to recognize it when it happens. The empath may not scream, seek revenge, or create a scene. Instead, they become quieter, clearer, and more selective. That shift is often misread as coldness, when it is actually self-respect finally becoming stronger than hope. A wounded empath does not necessarily become heartless. They become disciplined. They learn that understanding another person's wounds does not require tolerating repeated emotional harm. They begin to see that compassion without limits becomes self-abandonment, and that lesson transforms them. Once that transformation happens, the old access point is gone. The person who once met your flaws with patience now meets them with distance. The person who once searched for your potential now measures your patterns. The person who once softened the room with grace now protects their peace with boundaries. The deeper lesson is that hurting an empath ultimately reveals more about the offender than about the empath. It exposes emotional immaturity, lack of accountability, dishonesty, and the habit of taking sincere people for granted. Over time, the empath grows wiser, but the person who caused the damage may later face the heavier consequence, realizing what was lost. Attention can be replaced, convenience can be replaced, attraction can be replaced. But genuine emotional safety, deep understanding, and loyal presence are not easily replaced. Many discover too late that what they dismissed as sensitivity was actually rare human depth. For the empath, the message is equally important and empowering. Your pain is not proof that your caring nature was a mistake. Your depth is not the problem. Your ability to love, understand, and support others is not a weakness. The real mistake was offering sacred emotional energy to people who wanted comfort without honesty, closeness without responsibility, and forgiveness without change. Growth means refusing to let pain harden the heart while still allowing it to sharpen discernment. The strongest empath is not the one who keeps enduring disrespect to prove loyalty. It is the one who learns that protecting peace is also an act of love. In that sense, the brutal consequence of hurting an empath is not revenge, but permanent loss. Loss of trust, loss of warmth, loss of access, and loss of the rare kind of connection that many people spend their entire lives searching for after they have already destroyed it. An empath is often misread by the world because many people confuse softness with weakness, when in reality empathy is usually paired with sharp observation, emotional intelligence, and an unusual ability to notice what others ignore. An empath does not only hear words, they study patterns, energy, inconsistency, and the hidden meaning behind behavior. That is why hurting an empath has consequences that go much deeper than one argument or one moment of betrayal. The wound is not just emotional pain, it becomes information. The empath learns from it, stores it, and eventually changes because of it. At first, they may offer patience, understanding, and repeated chances, because their first instinct is often to understand the pain behind someone's actions rather than simply condemn the behavior. But that patience is frequently misunderstood. People assume that if the empath stays calm, keeps forgiving, and continues showing care, then they must not see what is happening. The truth is usually the opposite. They see far more than they say, and they remain kind long after most people would have walked away. The first brutal consequence of hurting an empath is that you lose access to the safest version of them. Before repeated harm, an empath often offers a rare kind of connection. Presence without judgment, support without calculation, and loyalty that is grounded in sincerity rather than convenience. They become the person who reads between the lines, who senses distress before it is spoken, and who often creates emotional safety simply by being genuine. When that kind of person is repeatedly disrespected, manipulated, or taken for granted, something eventually shifts inside them. They stop trying to hold the relationship together alone. They stop explaining pain to someone who clearly benefits from pretending not to understand it. They stop offering softness where there is no responsibility. This change is not always loud or dramatic. In fact, the most powerful change in an empath is often silent. They become calm in a different way, not because they feel less, but because they finally see clearly. That clarity is devastating for anyone who relied on their patience as permission to continue harmful behavior. Once an empath connects self-respect to awareness, the old access point closes. The second consequence is more psychological and often more painful over time. The person who hurt the empath begins to realize that what was lost cannot easily be replaced. Attention is easy to find. Temporary affection is easy to find. Surface-level relationships are easy to find. But real emotional depth, loyalty, intuitive understanding, and sincere support are rare. Many people only understand the value of an empath after they have damaged the relationship beyond repair. They discover too late that what looked like sensitivity was actually strength, and what looked like emotional openness was actually a gift requiring maturity to receive. The empath may no longer argue, chase, or demand closure. Instead, they withdraw their energy, belief, trust, and emotional investment. That absence becomes the true consequence. It forces the other person to face the difference between being admired and being deeply known, between being entertained and being genuinely understood. When an empath leaves internally, the space they once filled often becomes impossible to ignore because they were never just present. They were stabilizing, healing, and interpreting emotional reality in a way few people can. The final lesson is educational and empowering for both sides. For the person who causes harm, the message is simple. Never mistake compassion for weakness, and never assume sincere people will endure endless disrespect. Empathy has limits, and once those limits are crossed often enough, the empath does not become cruel. They become selective. For the empath, the lesson is equally important. Pain should not convince you that your caring nature was a mistake. Your ability to feel deeply, understand people, and offer emotional honesty is not the problem. The problem is giving priceless emotional access to those who treat it like something ordinary. Growth means keeping your compassion, but strengthening your boundaries. It means understanding that love without discernment becomes self-neglect, while love guided by wisdom becomes strength. The strongest empath is not the one who keeps suffering to prove loyalty. It is the one who learns that protecting peace is a form of maturity. In the end, the brutal consequence of hurting an empath is permanent loss. Because once they truly detach, what disappears is not just their presence, but the rare kind of warmth, trust, and understanding that many people search for years after they have carelessly thrown it away.